Hello, Dürle. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just needed to test this. Actually, I can also record here, but maybe for safety. Do you see this? Okay, so we now have double recording because last time I forgot to record a bit. Good, then let's start. Good. So I call this agent-based behavioral modeling, and what that is meaning, I think, should become clear over the seminar. So what I mean by agent and what we mean by behavioral modeling. Before I start, I want to say, of course, thank you to two PhD students with whom a lot of this work happened. One, Rasmus, who also joined today, on whose actual PhD project the material actually is based. So we will look at two example experiments and models for those, which are kind of control experiments, if you want, in Rasmus' work. So it's not his actual PhD or project of interest, which is about linking perceptual and economic decision making, and we will look into things individually. But he actually recorded the data and also wrote the data analysis, the data acquisition script, and so it's essentially his experimental work, and of course also kind of the theoretical stuff. Although I also did a little bit on that. And the other person who I've been working with for some time is Lilla, also a PhD student, and she's working on two projects that are a little bit different. One is a vendor project, the other one is a more involved grid world search task. But a lot of the concepts that will come about, like different model types and so on, we also kind of worked out in many discussions. So of course, there's a lot of influence of also from these projects in what I'm going to show you. So these were the acknowledgements. So first, some background, why I'm talking about this and what this is about and how it is motivated. So in principle, and kind of in the big scheme of things in terms of the mission, CCN, by which I mean both our labs, so our Arbeitsbereich Computational Cognitive Neuroscience at FU currently, as well as the entire or the field of research, so cognitive computational neuroscience or computational cognitive neuroscience, develops and empirically validates quantitative models of cognition. So on the one hand, we do modeling work. On the other hand, we do experimental work to inform our models by this experimental work. And of course, this agent-based behavioral modeling is just happening in the big scheme of this. And this, of course, doing cognitive modeling and building cognitive models is not new, and the form of cognitive models that we use, which are probabilistic, if you want, you can call them Bayesian models. This is not new. It has a long history in cognitive neuroscience. Basically what we have been also looking at it in the past are models relating to the Bayesian brain hypothesis. So I did some work in EEG using Bayesian learners. I did some work in decision making using kind of Bayes optimal considerations. And of course, free energy principle and active inference are kind of these famous Bayesian brain hypothesis models by Carl Friston. And these kind of cognitive models, of course, have been influential in at least my way of thinking about cognitive models. So this is one line of research where this is coming from. On the other hand, there has been quite some probabilistic control theory and operations research, which comes under the name of partially observable Markov decision processes, which has been around also for a long time. This is mainly associated with Bellman, so 1950s operations research. And this kind of research line, although known a little bit in AI, is somewhat new in cognitive neuroscience, so it has not been that much exploited, let's say. But it's also there. It has, so it's not novel in the sense that this probabilistic optimal control theory is new. The only thing that's new that these things are also considered in cognitive neuroscience more. So that's another line of research that motivates what we are doing. And then a fairly current line of research, although actually based on the probabilistic optimal control theory from the 90s, let's say, is this agent-based problem solving in AI research. This is also not really new in AI research. So if you look into computer science AI books, they have chapters on reasoning under uncertainty and using agents. So I don't really know how long this has been around, but what in AI research, but what I know is that in the last 5 years or so, by combining agent-based problem solving with neural networks, so deep learning, there has been a bit of a hype around this. You will have heard that it became possible to beat human performance in Go and so on. Of course, this is also, I mean, this has been happening for some time. You might remember in the 90s there was this Deep Blue computer, chess computer, which won again. Well, I actually don't remember who won. I think first Kasparov won and then Deep Blue won or something. So it's also not really new, but it has been a little bit hyped over the last 5 years, specifically with relating to DeepMind, and then this newfound interest in artificial intelligence. That was before, if you remember, if you're a little bit older, that was before climate change and before Corona. There was a hype in AI. You don't hear much about AI these days, which is not quite true. There's this new idea about digital immunity, using cell phones and tracking whether you encountered somebody with Corona. Anyway, AI, maybe you still remember that there was a hype on this. So that's all fine, and this is where all this is coming from, and it's also kind of recent topics in cognitive neuroscience. And what I think is then important, especially if we are in cognitive neuroscience and not in AI research, is that we realize that we use these agents that are being developed as models. So we don't, we develop these models, so we also make new suggestions of how you can solve this or that problem. But in addition to that, we want to use them to explain behavioral data. And if we want to do that, we have to basically follow the standard line of analyzing data in a probabilistic setting. So we have to statistically embed them. And this is, at least to me, that's important. And that's kind of one motivation. So we want to kind of use state-of-the-art agent-based or agent models for explaining cognition, but we also want to statistically embed them. And so that's kind of what we want to do. So be state-of-the-art with respect to AI research, but also respect that our aim is different from AI research. So we don't want to suggest a new method which may be a little bit better than some other method. We want to do behavioral modeling. We want to explain human behavior. And so in the big picture setting, we thus want to formulate, implement, and empirically validate novel behavioral models. So that's kind of the big picture background. So yeah, and this is also important here. Formulation means we want to do that mathematically, so on paper, writing that out. Implement means we program the stuff, and empirical validators, of course, we bring it together with experimental data. We do experiments and we analyze the experimental data. So that's kind of the scope of what we want to do. Maybe a little different way to look at this is from more, so this was kind of the academia science, that's the academic surroundings in which we're doing that, which motivates certain things. And if you want to look at it more from a purely scientific perspective, if we look into basic cognitive science, then mass levels of analysis are always helpful. Can you raise your hand if you heard about mass levels of analysis previously, please? So majority of you has heard about that. No, half of you. Good. The other ones we heard it for the first time. So David Murray, he was a computational psychologist, late 70s, early 80s, and he in his works on vision, he described these different levels of analyses, which I always find quite helpful when thinking about cognitive neuroscience problems. So he distinguished first the computational level, which is a little bit of a strange name, because what does computation mean anyway? But the topic of this computational level is to describe the problem. So the question in mass level, when trying to explain some cognitive function, the first question to ask in his view is, what is the problem? And this is what we will then see in our work as talking about the task at hand. And what I think is a good way to address the computational level is to use the language of partially observable Markov decision processes, because that's the language that has been used to describe problems under uncertainty or of decision-making under uncertainty for some time. It's been tested and has been shown to be useful. So I think it's a good idea to adopt this language. Then Ma describes mentions the algorithmic level. That's then the question of how the problem can be tackled, and this is what we here then do using agent-based problem solving. And this refers to algorithms. This refers to our agents, and they use essentially in the broad picture setting methods like probabilistic inference, dynamic programming, and things relating to reinforcement learning. So it's a little bit tricky with the terms dynamic programming or reinforcement learning. The DeepMind AI researchers right now that use a lot of Markov decision process theory, a lot of dynamic programming, they call all of this reinforcement learning, because they call it reinforcement learning because they have this interaction between agents and tasks in over repeated trials in mind. So it makes sense for them to call it reinforcement learning. If you're in cognitive neuroscience and in biology and so on, if you hear reinforcement learning, you might mainly think of Pavlov and the dog and the bell and the saliva, and then maybe Rescola Wagner. What the computer scientists or the AI researchers, maybe I should say, mean by reinforcement learning is actually what, from our perspective, we would call online partially observable Markov decision process solving. So with this reinforcement learning term, this is why I'm not calling, if I would call these things reinforcement learning for cognitive neuroscientists, that would be a way too shallow for what we actually do. But if you look into the AI literature, you will find the term reinforcement learning quite often. Finally, and I just want to make that clear, is that, of course, in cognitive neuroscience, we should also care about the implementational level. So how these algorithms are realized by neural systems. And this, I think, is an important task for computational cognitive neuroscience. Otherwise, it would be computational cognitive science. Currently, we are not doing that, and everything that I will present today also has nothing to do with, or there will be no neuro aspects. There will be a little bit like neuro inspiration, like you have neuro inspiration in neural networks, and you have neuro inspiration in or kind of behavioral inspiration in reinforcement learning. But at present, we are addressing only the computational and the algorithmic level to explain behavior. Yeah, I just want to make that clear. So there is no neuroscientific modeling involved. And of course, that would be a nice task for the future. You know that we have done some biophysical modeling in EEG and also fMRI, and of course the long time goal will be to link these models, the agent-based models, with proper biophysical neuroimaging data generating models. But we also know, at least the people who have worked on these kind of projects, that already doing computational level and algorithmic level modeling is quite a lot. And if you want to know more about also linking that to neural data, ask Lilla and ask Lilla about what she thinks about linking it with fMRI, and maybe also ask Rasmus what he thinks about linking it with fMRI. Actually, you will hear about two different ways one can do that, and both of them are actually not what I envision for this level. Yeah, so just that it's clear that although we are a neuroscience lab, currently neuroscience is a little bit on the back burner. Good. If you want to get started, so this is now for people getting started on this, and also maybe people who have already got started and want to continuously read about things. I put here a little bit of a reading list that over the couple of months that or years now that we've been working on this came together that I find useful. Actually, I wanted to put all of these references into this seminar folder. I might do that later. I haven't done that, but you have the reference list, and I guess you know how to get references. So I really recommend that you do background reading. So I think starting point to agent-based problem solving in AI research are these sections in the AI book by Russell and Norvig. They are somewhat formal, but I think relatively light. I haven't really read them. They just skipped over them, and they look useful, but only to a certain degree. But at least they give you and us kind of the nomenclature that AI researchers would use, and they are also in a way nice and a little bit spannend and fancy. If you want to learn, and you will have to learn more about the more formal language and where this is coming from, I think very good sources for learning the language of optimal control theory, so partially or observable macro decision processes, are these books. Patterman, the Bertzikas books are quite interesting. So in the Bertzikas book on neurodynamic programming, so these are actually not from 2005, they are from the late 90s. These are just the versions that I got. So this neurodynamic programming from the late 90s, this is actually what this discusses, bringing together neural networks and optimal control theory. So this is what DeepMind is doing now. So 20 years later, they've been reading Bertzikas' book and following that up. Of course, Bertzikas, they didn't really invent this. And some other books. This I only recently discovered. I don't know how useful it is. It looks a little bit, so this is about reinforcement learning algorithms. It looks a little bit better than the book that you don't see here, and you should read, namely the Sutton and Bartow book, which is just confusing. Then if you want to, so this is kind of where which is basically me saying these are good books, but if you read them, you might have the feeling that this is of no interest to anyone currently because these are old books and so on. So to give you the feeling that the hottest company on the planet, namely DeepMind, is doing what we are doing. These are some examples for agent-based problem solving in current AI research. So these are kind of these, a couple of them are these big Nature and Science papers that they have, which are not very good, these papers, because they hardly tell what's going on. So they have one equation and in the rest they talk that it's awesome. They have better papers at DeepMind. So if you look at recent preprints and so on, and conference contributions, they have papers that actually contain some meat. For example, this Schrittwieser, the Wayne paper, the Resende paper. They are quite good, and you get a feeling that of what they are doing, what the problems are. Of course, what they are not trying to do is explain human behavior. What they are trying to do, in a way, is to get to human level performance. So sometimes they do a little bit of human experiments also, especially if they use these kind of 3D tasks like computer games, which we have started a little bit working on, but haven't really followed up that much yet. But it's also something that I really would like to do. But so they record human data on these computer games as well, and then they compare, but they don't really do behavioral modeling. So this then should show everyone, or at least you guys, that this is hot stuff that we are dealing with. And finally, the thing that I think is important, namely that we don't only think we are doing hot stuff, but also that we have to do a little bit more than these people here, at least in terms of what we're using it for, is how these agents can be used for behavioral modeling. And this is also one motivation for actually talking about it and also then writing this tutorial, because there hasn't been that much of really good literature, because most behavioral modeling literature in cognitive neuroscience is related to drift diffusion models. And so there are tons of papers about drift diffusion models. Yes, we know that now. And there are some papers about Scholar-Wagner models, but so basically to actually use state-of-the-art AI and use this in a statistically embedded framework, this is not really around. There are good papers nevertheless that are worthwhile reading. So the Dayan and Dor paper, that's very nice. Jean Denisot 10 years ago did some good work that was not framed at all in this agent-based setting, but more in terms of Bayesian learning, but also actually, so he called this meta-Bayesian models. So it made clear that you have a kind of Bayesian observer or agent models, which he didn't call agents, but I think observers, because this whole thing was called observing the observer. And then these are embedded. So these are good papers with a little bit of the physics math that always comes with Jean and so on. And Carl Friston has a paper that discusses active inference as a process model. It doesn't really embed it, but at least tries to make a little bit clearer that active inference and free energy principle are not only now there to explain the universe, but also can be used as computational cognitive models. And then there's the Farrell-Lewandowski, which is okay. I mean, it's a behavioral modeling book, but it's for starters, it's definitely good. And then there's Liller's new supervisor, who has written something on Bayesian models recently, which is also good, not that deep, because it's kind of a primer in neuron, but also a starting point. So Lilla, can you raise your hand if you still plan to go there actually, or has this been proposed? Okay, sounds good. Because obviously it's in New York and we all know what's going on, but maybe we'll start a little bit later. We'll discuss that. Good. So that was kind of the background and motivations. Are there questions about background motivation right now? Anything that you would like to clarify? If yes, please raise your hand. If not, that's also fine. Good. So then what I actually prepared now is three things. First, a general framework that tries to at least give some nomenclature about how we are using or how we are doing this agent-based behavioral modeling, and then two example cases. One, a perceptual decision-making study or perceptual choice study, where people had to identify which of two Gabor patches or visual patches has a higher contrast, and that was quite subtle. So it was a kind of hard perceptual decision-making task, and it's a typical task in decision neuroscience. The other one, also a typical task, and actually one that relates to the topic of the Levico a little bit more, because that was a learning task, and the Studienstiftung's Levico, that was what they wanted to do. I don't know what the plan currently is, but what they wanted to do is to do something with memory and learning. And a typical learning tasks are the state action reward contingency learning tasks that we will see later, which are then typically modeled with the Scholar-Wagner type learning models. So these will be two application studies that I want to show you. But before I show you these application studies, I have started also then in terms of writing this up to frame the whole thing that we are doing in terms of a general framework. And this is what I want to start with. I have to say, with the general framework, at least two things. So first of all, it's work in progress with the general framework. So it's not done. That's a little bit like for people who know about this, like free energy principle and active inference. So there is a general framework, yes, and then it's just, oh, prediction error gets minimized. There's a general framework, but that general framework doesn't then really help you that much, or there's still a lot of things to do if you actually apply it to a given problem. So this general framework is only, in its usefulness, only goes so far. The other thing, it's definitely not done, and what I definitely also don't want to claim, especially now also as a heads up for those people who have worked on problems, I'm not claiming that this general framework is not plastic and that this is the right way. Yeah. So it's interesting to try, and this is what I've also been trying from these two case studies, to think about what are the kind of the general things. But then you, as we will see in a specific example, then if you have this general framework in mind and you have this specific example, then it's still there's sometimes some mismatch. One typical example of that that we will see later is the question of rewards. So if you want to discuss the question of whether rewards are observations or something different than observations, that's something to discuss with Lilla. So in this general framework that I will show you now, there are rewards and observations, but then you could also argue that maybe rewards are just observations and so on. So I'm not saying that this general framework is particularly correct in any kind of way, or not, or final in any kind of way. So that's just what I want to say before now explaining it. And instead of getting Zoom bombed, I get shouted at by at least Lilla and Rasmus that, but that's not correct. Good. One thing that in terms of this general framework that in my world at least is somewhat set in stone is that we should always distinguish between three components, which are relating to three things. Essentially, they relate to the world, namely the task that a given agent is doing. And we call this, because we don't have a better name, we call that the task model. which is a probabilistic formulation of the choice environment. It's essentially what you write as your experiment, and in a way you could say that the task model is completely defined by your experiment presentation code, or let's say if we continue, and like I said, we also started a little bit with Lina on that. Unfortunately, we had to stop that, but the computer game, so in the long run, it would be nice to have computer games mainly being used. This computer game, and that is, you could argue, so sorry, that's what I wanted to say, you could argue that the code that presents the simulated world in which humans or artificial agents act embed or represents the task model. That's true, but we also found that of course code and thinking about what the code does is not doesn't necessarily map one-to-one. So we've also, it helps to have a explicit formalization beyond just the code to basically develop then the agents who interact with this world. So that's the task model. It's a description of the task. It's the computational level according to Ma. In general, it's a probabilistic formulation of the choice environment. This is how I would call it. And I would, currently, I also see it a little bit separate from the actual code that's running the experiment, because it's kind of a meta and mathematical description of what the code is doing. It's not the code itself, which implements essentially the task model. And it represents, of course, the task model. Of course, we're doing these experiments to simulate the real world. So in this sense, the task model is representing the choice ecology, the real world, however you want to call it. Then we have, of course, the agent model, hence agent-based behavioral modeling. And by an agent, essentially we mean, I think, an algorithmic formulation of a task solution. And already, so in a way, it's kind of clear what the agent is. The agent kind of can observe parts of the world and then can act, of course. That's why I want to call these things agents. So they learn, but they also act. So in this sense, they go beyond Bayesian learners. So they are not just probabilistic learners, but they act, so agents. And if, so in other studies, I'm just using Bayesian learners. I don't want to call them agents because they don't act, they don't influence the environment, so hence agents. And yeah, they solve the task in some way. And of course, if you talk about task solutions, then you already need to, there are different ways to solve tasks. So the question is, so you can differentiate things like optimal task solutions or non-optimal task solutions, which are still task solutions. So especially the thing of what the aim of an agent is, in a way it's constrained by the task, but it can also mismatch. And I think these things we also in the individual projects that I will show, we haven't quite worked out. And I'm not saying that there's a true and correct solution, but it's not always necessarily clear what a solution is and whether the solution is given by the task or the agent. And I think it's actually more given by the agent than by the task. Finally, but it's different. It's definitely a different thing than the. So I think the task. So the world. So the idea here is, in terms of philosophy, is that the task exists even without the agent. Well, one could also discuss that, but definitely because the agent doesn't have access to everything that is in the task, task and agent are a little bit different things. And in a way, we just don't, so what I don't want is that so I want that there is an outside world, that the agent is not just playing games in their head and that's it, and lying in its matrix like Beth and just solving tasks inside their head. So the belief behind this is that there is an external world, and that what the agent actually believes about the external world can, to a certain degree, actually be correct. It doesn't need to be fully correct, but yeah. So there is an external world. Finally, and that's quite important, I think, and something that is easily overlooked, is that when we do an experiment, we have the participant playing a computer game, and we model the participant's brain, or the way it solves things using artificial agents, but we observe this interaction. And then from the step, or from what the agent does, from what the participant does to our observation, there still can be errors. Yeah. So there is an additional step when observing the task and the agent model, and we have to make sure that if we then compare different agent models, so different behavioral models, that we account for that in a valid statistical setting. I think that will get clear once I show you the examples. So Saloni, you had a question. Please ask your question.
I was just wondering if the task model is from agent's perspective, or is it something that is
Yeah, that's a
set?
good point. So the way we do it actually currently is and also for these examples that I will show, is that, and this is also what we will see later on, is that the agent itself incorporates the or a task model. So in terms of we use object-oriented programming for all of this, and the agent will have a property or an attribute that is actually the task model. And so in a way, it's it's a little bit tricky, because the task model, on the one hand, it's through the lens of the agent, and also, for example, in Lilla's, or in many of these projects, but in Lilla's we explicitly discussed that a couple of times, is that, for example, the likelihood of observations in the task, the agent knows that. Why? This is also one of the reasons why we differentiate that, because one needs to be fairly explicit about what the agent knows about the task. Now, it's through the lens of the agent, because of course the agent can also be wrong about certain assumptions of the task. In most of the current projects, I think the agents have a veridical representation of the task. So we assume, and also because we tell the participants what's going on, we assume that they represent the task quite well. So the perspective of the agent towards the task, as well as the real task, are fairly identical. But that does not need to be the case. Yeah. So I think it's definitely, in terms of this kind of thinking in a Bayesian manner about this thing, and that things are always subjective, the agent actually deals with its own representation of the task. Having said that, there's still the assumption that whatever the agent observes is not something that the agent generates, but that's coming from the outside. Yeah? So actually, this is kind of basically showing these kind of levels, so behavioral model, task model, and agent model. And you see that here the task model is definitely outside of the agent. So which is also then not completely consistent with what I will have later, because the agent also has access to certain aspects of the task, but it's still conceived, and this is what I'm trying to say with that it's not completely matrix type. It's still conceived that there is an external world, and that there are some regularities, and what physicists do makes some sense to describe the world. So in this sense, the task, you could also say there are two task models. There is the real world task model, and there's the subjective task model that is in the agent. Currently, these are mainly identical. in all of the projects. But one can, of course, make that explicit that they are fairly divergent. Yeah. So one could also discuss kind of task model T external, which describes the regularities of the real world, and then a task model T internal, which describes the agent's perspective on the external task model. Yeah. Good. This shows a kind of a representation of this general framework. So again, there's kind of the outside world in terms of the task model, and this task model has some kind of state at a given time point, which yeah, kind of captures the current setting of the task. And this state generates something or has aspects that are observable. So partially observable Markov decision processes mean that certain parts of the state are observable, whereas others are not. This observable part can be observed by the agent. So the agents can make observations. They then form usually what is called belief states, so an internal probabilistic representation about the external task state. And based on the belief state, which can also be something like a current estimate of a parameter of the task model, they make a decision. And one thing that I have now, and also in terms of the nomenclature, kind of defined, and I think is helpful, is to distinguish between decisions and actions. Of course, it's not really in the words themselves, it's more in the definitions. So by decision, I always mean, and we will see that later in examples, I mean something that is internal to the agent. So the agent decides that's the best thing to do. But what we observe is the action that the agent takes, and the decision. There can be a mismatch between the action that the agent takes and the decision that the agent did. For example, I think in behavioral economics, they also call this the trembling hand phenomenon. So if you decide to press the left button, but because your hands are shaking, because you're so excited to be doing this very interesting experiment, you erroneously press the right button, although you decided to press the left button, then your action would be to would have been pressing the right button, whereas your decision was pressing the left button. So the decision is something that is internal to the agent, something that is not directly observed, something theoretical. The action is our experimental observation, because in the end we observe behavior and we observe actions. So don't think too much about the words. You can, in a way, I think it's natural to do it this way around rather than the other way around. It also maps nicely on how things are called in probabilistic, in Markov decision processes, where things are always called actions. I think if you read active inference, or at least as far as I remember, so in Carl's world, I think he calls things also control states, maybe, in when he means decisions. I'm not quite sure, but there is kind of a difference between what the agent decides and wants to do with respect to what we then observe. And this can be because there's something going wrong. And this is also how you should think about the agent. The agent is kind of this singularity somewhere in the brain. But from there, of course, many things can go wrong. And all this post-decision motor kind of stuff that then goes away from the brain and where things can go wrong, this then can come in at this transition from decision to action. Yeah. So here I put the brain behind the agent, because of course that's what we think. But the way I think about the agent is kind of it's a singularity in the brain, or it's a network in the brain, whatever. But it's it's not, and this is, I think, the important thing, the agent is not the whole human and including their hands and so on. The agent is this kind of cognitive program that happens only in the brain, and which also leads to the fact that only that it doesn't really have access to, for example, retinal activation patterns, but only to primary visual cortex activation patterns, and then still from its output regions or motor cortex to the execution with the hand or with the foot or something, things can go wrong. Yeah. So this is kind of it's kind of the same agent model that kind of free energy principle and active inference have in mind. Yeah, and then there can be some reward, and this you can so you can actually, this is a big discussion. Currently, reward is all here outside, but of course, and it can be observed. But I think this really let's see how this develops, this whole framework. So in terms of if you do standard yeah, if you come from standard cognitive neuroscience, rewards tend to be in the outside world. But if you start thinking more about rewards, then they are actually not in the outside world, but they are something that there are some observations that are somewhat rewarding for some agents. So yeah, in any case, it's developing. Yeah, but the more important thing is here that we should talk about what the task is about. We should talk about what the agent is about. We should be careful not to. We should be careful to distinguish between what the agent knows about the task and what the agent doesn't know, because that's what participants always face in these tasks. And we should be careful to distinguish between what agents decide and what we as experimenters actually observe. Okay, so that's the general framework. So yeah, I think the next couple of slides are kind of recapitulating what I explained, and then they also give kind of an outlook of what we then will look at in examples. So I suggest I go over the last couple of slides, and then we have roughly 1 hour, and then we take a break. That would be the plan for now. So in terms of the task model, what we always or what we talk about are states, both the observable and the unobservable aspects, and the actions. So states, yeah, you can think about states as the context. I think I still, a good definition of a state is still eluding me. I think there's one in Sutton and Bartow, which I think Lilla might recall, because I remember Lilla saying or telling it to me. So a state is somehow everything that is of control worthiness or something like that. Lilla, do you know right now the state definition from Sutton and Bartow?
I mean, no, the short answer, but I say that like all the important signals from the environment that are relevant to
something like this. I think at one point I remember you telling me that how a little bit more formally what this is. So there are good definitions of state, but I'm still for what we are doing here don't really have that good of a general definition. You will see states later, and then it will be quite obvious what a state is. But the problem with the state, and also this is a big, I think one of the problems with states is also, and it's not a big problem, but it's kind of the nature of this whole endeavor, is that there's usually not only one sensible definition of a state in a given task. So you can, if you have a given problem, it takes some time to converge to a state definition that you find is working with. So for example, in this treasure hunt experiment with Lilla, we had a couple of iterations to come up with a good state representation. I think sometimes it can be equivalently. So that's one thing that in Rasmus' work, I think we will have to address at one point, because we could, I think, reframe a lot of things as like that there's a good state and a bad state. like we are doing it in Lillard's bandit problem right now, instead of estimating this contingency parameter. But I think it would be equivalent, so I don't think it's a problem. But I think, so states, let's have a look at examples, then I think it gets clearer. Actions, I think, are part of the task model because, at least the way we do the experiments, I mean, there are only certain actions allowed. You can press the 2 buttons. Any other actions, even if the agent can think of many other and more actions, they will not really afflict something, and rewards we already discussed. So there are some structural components which are then usually formulated as mathematical sets, and there are some dynamic components which we usually, I think we define as probability distributions. If you read the Berthikas, you will sometimes see this equivalent way of formulating things as functions plus noise. One can do that. I think in Lillard's work we also have that sometimes, or at least we have it in some of the old treasure hunt stuff still. One can do that, so function plus noise. In general, especially if one then does some derivations, I think it's more helpful to start already there with a probability distribution rather than a function plus noise, which is the same thing, but it's a little bit easier to see. So that's happening in the task model. In the agent model, and this is what the picture didn't show, is that the way I'm doing it now is that the agent model incorporates a copy of the task model. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the agent can access everything of the task. So for example, in these latent state examples that we will see in the first example, where it's a perceptual decision task, the state will not be accessible for the agent. Still, other aspects of the task are available to the agent. So there is a how can one call it, maybe a shallow copy of the task in the agent. And of course, like we discussed already, this task model that the agent incorporates can be fairly, if it's of interest, can be fairly distorted to the real task. But then we should call these two things maybe a little bit different. So the like external or internal task model. Then the agent has some structural components, so it will have observations, so what it can know about the state. It will have belief states as the probabilistic representation of the states. One thing that will come up is, and also a term that is a little bit idiosyncratic, are these decision valences. And by that, we mean what a lot of people call action values, actually. Lilla and I decided at one point that it's better to call, or I think I decided, so maybe Lilla agrees or maybe she doesn't, but the things are often called, so if you read cognitive neuroscience, that's always like expected values in the frontal cortex. And what we wanted to do is to, especially if we're talking about POMDPs, there's something called the value function. And the value function has a very precise meaning in POMDPs because it relates to optimal values. And we wanted to distinguish and be clear that we don't necessarily mean this. And hence we use the term valence to represent how much an agent values a certain decisions. We actually, when discussing with Lilla, this was always called action valence, so I have to be a little bit careful. But now it's decision valence because the decision is agent internal, and it just means if you have two possible decisions you can take, for example, press the right button and press the left button, then the decision valence is just a number you assign on each trial to the left and the right button. For example, 12 for the left button and 4 for the right button. And then the 12 means the decision of pressing the left button, because it's 12 is larger than the worth that you associate with this is higher than the other. Now it's just a number. We will see concrete examples for that, but it's kind of an idiosyncratic term that we introduced because it helps. And it doesn't necessarily have to do anything with expected value outside of the world or in an optimal setting and so on, and hence the term valence. And then based on the decision valences, we then usually define a decision function that maximizes the decision valence. But the decision valence is something that is purely agent internal and can be quite arbitrary. Exactly. So there's a decision valence function and there's a decision function. Of course, the agent has decisions, as already explained. The behavioral model, and that's the thing that we have to do as cognitive neuroscientists, then incorporates the agent model. Keep in mind that the agent model incorporates the task model. So the behavioral model has both the task model and the agent model. Has in addition the experimental observations, which are the actions, as I already explained, and it has this decision conditional action distribution, which we will see in examples, which describes the transformation from the agent decision to our observation, so the action observation, and incorporates things like so you can, it's always the question what that is. You can either call it observation noise. So for example, that observation noise I think is fine because you distinguish between the agent, which is in your head, and then everything that the singularity in your head, and then everything that happens until the human presses the button. It can also be the wind that pushes the hand of the participant a little bit along the keyboard in this windy experimental booth. But it can also just be this kind of deviation from this idealistic idea of what the agent does, because of course the agents are idealistic theories about how humans do decisions, and because we want to allow that people sometimes deviate from this idealistic view in terms of they deviate from this and they don't randomly explore. We will come to that later. We have this action distribution. I think that gets easiest once we see what's actually happening. Good. Yeah. So last slide before the break. So are there any questions right now, actually? Because if there are, then we might address them now. Otherwise, I will highlight the most important things again. Then I will highlight the most important things again. So there are some key aspects when doing the way that we are doing that. So one thing that I think is very important to focus on is that these three entities, the task model, the agent, and the behavioral model, they all will have certain probability distributions associated with them. Together, they actually induce a quite large probabilistic model. So by probabilistic models, I just mean a very large joint distribution over all the random variables that are random, at least from the perspective of us as experimenters, where we have to account for the fact that certain aspects are random to or uncertain, let's say uncertain for the agent, but not for the experimenter. In any case, if one sits down and does the math, it's always helpful to think in terms of the joint probability distribution of all the random variables that are involved, and basically get this joint distribution from the various conditional and marginal distributions that are part of these models, and then appropriately condition and marginalize. Yeah, but this is sometimes, I think this is often, or this is in general overlooked, definitely in cognitive neuroscience, sometimes even in the Markov decision process theory, that by defining a marginal here, a conditional there, another conditional here, you define a very large joint distribution. And if you clarify in your head what this joint distribution is, then to derive certain aspects actually fairly straightforward, but it requires first realizing that this is a large probabilistic model. Yeah, this relates to that. So we will see that you in formulating the task model and the agent model and the behavior model, you define certain probability distributions, so you don't have to worry about them. You define them, but by defining them, you will actually, because you define this very large probabilistic model, as certain other distributions will only be in there implicit, and you need to be aware of the fact that they are there, and sometimes you actually need them, especially if you do model fitting. We will see examples for that. Also, for example, the belief state is something, because that's kind of the probabilistic inference that the agent does. That's not in the definitions, but usually something you have to derive. In general, and this is something I briefly touched upon on the previous slide, is that the way that agents can decide based on their current knowledge about the task is that they can decide deterministic. So they, if they have a certain belief about the world and they have the certain belief state, they always do this. There's another way that they can behave stochastically, so that they decide. So they decide deterministically. Or another thing that they could do is to decide stochastically. So given a current belief state and a current setting of the agent, instead of always then doing this decision, they do a random decision. Careful, decision, not action. So that's in principle possible. In addition to this, there will always be some decision noise, or the other way to look at this, some deviation from this idealistic, deterministic, or stochastic behavior of decision behavior of the agent. If the agent is stochastic in its decisions, though, then we have two sources of noise. And we have to be carefully aware that if we have our experimental data, we have to dissociate whether this is actually deviating from the agent's decision function, or so in terms of action noise, or is this part of the agent decision function, but the decision function is stochastic. And this is from one number to get these two sources of noise. That's not necessarily trivial. It can be done. It's typical filtering. So Kalman filter, data science people know that. Data science people also know that Kalman filter solves corona these days. So it can be done, but it's not happening here. So this is something I just want to mention here, that in all projects that we are currently doing, we have deterministic decision functions. And I know Lilla also wanted to do some random decision functions, but then I push that we stay with deterministic decision functions. But I think in the future, Lilla will definitely use random decision functions together with filtering, that I hope. And finally, all this modeling, what is it good for? Of course, it's good for thinking, it's good for the soul, and it's a lot of fun. And one can solve and one can do some math. But then, of course, it's also mainly there, from my perspective, to serve as an intermediary, so somebody who's an intermediary between our cognitive intuition, so how we think cognition is happening, and our neuroscience, philosophy-inspired, psychological, maybe even way about thinking about how humans come up with their behavior, which of course is heavily going in there, but also the implementation, because I think the big task, of course, in cognitive or in science in general is to link the intuition we have and our general theories about how things work with the technical implementation to actually build statistical models that are useful. So this the models that we write down and that we formulate, they are helping us to get from our intuition about how cognition works to the implementation, which, however, also means that our implementation should be quite close to our model. Yeah. So the model variables, distributions, functions that I will discuss in these examples, they then also exist in the Python code. Yeah? So if there's a variable, I don't know, st, modeling the state, in the model, in the mathematical formulation, there is a variable st in the implementation, and the same for these functions, especially for the functions. So if there's a function that maps, I don't know, an observation to a belief state, so by evaluating the belief state distribution, this function is one of the methods of the agent object, and so on. So this is this is what this modeling is for, and also part of course, this kind of, if you want, transparent research, open science aspect of the whole thing. And it's stemming, of course, from the fact that you find a lot of code that doesn't do that, and then you have some description of some mathematical model in a paper, you have some code and they are not really aligned, and then it's, if you want to build on that, not really helpful. So this is also kind of the task that we are doing, or a task to ourselves, to keep the code and the model as much in line as possible. It will never be fully aligned because they are something different. So the model are some mathematical equations on a PDF, and the implementation is some code in a Python editor that also needs to run. So there will be certain differences, but as much as possible, they should be aligned. And as I said already, for the agents, task and behavioral model, object-oriented programming is very useful. So that's stemming from the treasure hunt experience. The reason why I switched from pure imperative programming to object-oriented programming was mainly because agents, they do something, so they have functions, so they are like program functions, but they also have memory and contain data. So they are also like variables. So they need kind of a programming implementation that combines both function aspects and data storage aspects. And this is what object-oriented programming allows you to do. And hence we use object-oriented programming. Good. So that again is the overview. And now before we take a break, and then look at a first example of all of this, questions. Good. There seem to be no questions. Then I would suggest that we take a break. Let me get out here and stop this.